All right, so please answer in the chat. Can you see the Word document on the screen? Awesome, thank you. Okay, so let's begin. The purpose of this video is to do two things. One is cover the histology of the uterus, because that wasn't present in previous terms, so I don't have a video for it. And the other one is to sort of model how to use the lab packets and how to look for what you need to look for, and just be a good independent learner for lab. So a lot of students are going to skip this opening material and try and get right to the nitty-gritty, and I understand why that is. However, if you don't read the sort of guide, you're going to miss out on some tips and tricks that will benefit you as students. So one thing is, each lab practical concerns one of the lab packets. So the first one will be on the one I have open right now. Then we'll be done with that. The second will be on vessels and anatomy of the heart and ventral cavity viscera, so primarily a gross anatomy practical. And then the third one is going to be the histology of all of the above. So one test per packet. A few things to keep in mind, and I'm not going to read every single one of these to you. These are just ideas for navigating the practical questions that are based on observations I've made about mistakes that students tend to make on the practical. I try to be very, very specific about how I word questions when I'm asking practical questions, because in an in-person practical setting, if you weren't sure what was being asked, you could simply raise your hand and then I would wander over to you and say, oh, I mean that clump of cells, not just the one cell. But because we're operating asynchronously and you guys will be taking practicals at different times, I'm not going to be available in the same capacity because I can't be there with you while you take it. So I use specific language to try and take the place of that, but it's your job to make sure that you understand what's being asked. And to that end, I've provided you with a little guide here so that you don't say, for example, identify a single cell when I'm asking you to say the name for a group of cells, right? One of the most common errors I see is this first one here. So I will read you this passage, and it goes like this. It is now assumed that you can recognize the different basic tissue types. So being able to differentiate epithelium from connective tissue and being able to recognize the different kinds of epithelium or the different kinds of connective tissue. And so now that the training wheels are off, we're past 241, I'm not going to directly ask you if something is, for example, dense regular connective tissue. You should know that by now. Now, identifying tissue types is specific to organs, and you're going to look for specific combinations and manifestations of tissue types to figure out what organ or tissue you're looking at. So the reason I say this is because I will ask a question occasionally like, identify this specific tissue type, and then I'll say something in the parentheses like specific to the organ. This is me telling you, you need to be more specific than, say, pseudostratified columnar epithelium. If I'm showing you a picture of the airway and I say identify the specific tissue, the answer should be respiratory epithelium, because that is specific to the organ system that we're covering in that unit. Yes, it is still pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, but when it is in the airway, we call it respiratory epithelium because it is involved in respiration. So that's what I'm trying to get you to say. And then other things are just specific words. So if I ask you to identify an opening, I'm telling you to identify an empty space that is an entrance onto something. If I say identify the space, I mean tell me what space. And for your information, the answer to that is never simply, quote, lumen, unquote. The lumen is the empty space in the middle of any histological preparation. You need to be more specific than that. Identify the passage. That means the passage is a hollow tube of some kind. Identify the vessel. This one is a big one. And this matters a lot on practical number 2. So identify the vessel. I'll point at something and students will say, brachiocephalic vessel. That means nothing to me. There is a brachiocephalic artery and there is also a brachiocephalic vein. You need to tell me if it's an artery or a vein. So you can't just use the word vessel as a stand-in. That amounts to answering the question with the wording from the question, which is not the way to do it. So yeah, just make sure you read the rest of this. And then if I have a hint or an instruction in a question, please follow it. Because if the text of your answer does not exactly match what I've supplied Canvas with, Canvas will mark you wrong whether or not you're technically correct. So if you want to avoid that, make sure that if I say that an answer has 2 words, you use 2 words, or if I tell you to not put left and right, don't go ahead and do that thinking you're going to get extra kudos from me for doing so. You won't. All you'll get is a bunch of wrong answers that I will have to go in and fix for you. Similarly, don't hedge your bets by putting every possible term for a structure in. Again, that won't work because Canvas will be like, wow, that's a lot of words, you're wrong. And then I'll have to go in and correct it. So don't write me a novel, keep it short and sweet. Give me only what I'm asking for in the briefest terms possible. Okay, so that's my little spiel about success on online practicals. You'll see more of what I mean when you get there. I do my best to make them clear, but. So now let's go down to the uterus because that is the organ for which I have yet to make a video. Oh, as we pass, this is something that I'm finding students are missing. I think just because they're looking at pictures and not reading. So I've made this to work for either in-person labs or online labs, but if you don't read, you're going to be confused. So it says on the models or in text figures, parentheses, if online. This is me telling you if you're in an online class, I'm not going to use models, I'm going to use text figures. So this is what you guys are responsible for since we are online. I don't have models at my house and I can't get them, so I can't use them. All right, so cruising on down to the uterus. So uterus is underlined, meaning it's the major organ that you need to identify. So if I were to put a uterus in front of you and say, identify the organ in the field of view, organ means tell me the whole organ. Field of view means ignore any pointers. Just tell me what you see in the picture as a whole. Sometimes questions come in 2 parts where I will say, identify the organ in the field of view. And the second portion of the question will say, identify the structure highlighted in yellow. So in that case, you would say first the organ and then the structure. So you need to be careful and make sure that you're reading the question being asked and not getting excited and just typing in what you see before taking the time to understand what's being asked. That's another error I see frequently, is students kind of firing off an answer before actually taking the time to stop and take a breath and read, which is a big mistake. So don't do that. Okay, so we're gonna go look at the uterus and you need to identify each layer. So many organs that we will cover have layers, meaning sheets of tissue that are different from each other and have different functions. So we're going to examine that for the uterus right now. So I'm going to bring up histologyguide.com. This is what you should be using. I've provided you with 2 PDF copies of histology atlases. You should be using these to read about the histological features of the organ or tissue in question and guide your discovery of what you're looking at. So I'm going to click female reproductive system. And then I'm going to travel down to the uterus. Now note, you have a lot of different options for this. I am going to pick a chunk of tissue that has all 3 layers. I particularly like this proliferative phase 1 because this is the time during which the uterus is responding to the ovarian hormones and preparing to receive the product of conception, or just an unfertilized egg, which it will later get rid of. So one of the trickier tasks in identifying the layers of the uterus is figuring out which is the luminal side, meaning the side that faces where a baby would be, and which is the outside, which means the side that faces the pelvic cavity. So this up here is the luminal side, and down here is the pelvic side. So I'm going to grab my pen as well and point out different things as we move through the tissue. So with Histology Guide, you can navigate by clicking the magnification buttons, or you can just use the slider, and you can drag the slide around, or you can use the arrow buttons. I prefer dragging and then using the slider just because it gets me a little bit more precise magnification, but you can navigate however you see fit. Okay, so during the proliferative phase, the mucosa of the uterus becomes thickened. So mucosa is a name for the epithelium and underlying loose connective tissue that faces the lumen of any hollow organ. In the case of the uterus, we have this very specialized mucosa that is designed to grow and shrink with each ovarian cycle, because it grows and shrinks in response to ovarian hormones. And then if not used, it sloughs off, and that gives us the menstrual period. So I am going to outline and also bracket the endometrium in this view. So I'm going to bracket it first. Actually, let's move a little bit to the side here. There we go. So that's the endometrium. And let's draw sort of the limit on it. So what divides it from the tissue below, which I will mention momentarily. So I'm just going to take my yellow. And as you can see from my outline, the division between the endometrium and the underlying layer, which is the myometrium, isn't straightforward. It's not a straight line. It's not flat, and almost nothing in biology is. It is wavy. So everything above the yellow squiggly line is endometrium, and all of the stuff below it, at least in this field of view, is myometrium. So features of the endometrium, if you zoom in, and I'm going to do that now, but before I do, just notice these spaces. So these are uterine glands. And then if you look here very closely, and I'll zoom in on this area as well, you can see some blood vessels there as well. So we call these spiral arteries. The whole purpose of the endometrial layer is to provide a comfy, nourishing environment for an embryo to burrow into. And so the tissue is specifically designed for that purpose. So let's zoom in a little further, and we'll just have a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to zoom in here first. Sorry, sometimes Histology Guide is uncooperative. All right, so here we have the endometrium. It is a richly infolded mucosa consisting of, let's wait for it to buffer. You can see a pseudostratified epithelium here. So it's a columnar epithelium, it's pseudostratified, very, very thick. And all of these little holes of it just represent the fact that although this tissue has been sliced very thin, there are lots of little infoldings and tunnels into this rich mucosal layer. So we've got epithelium here, and then the cells in between are loose connective tissue. We call these lamina propria cells. Lamina propria is the layer that is underneath the epithelium. Now I know it doesn't especially look underneath in this view, so I will scroll to the top and show you that it indeed is. And up we go. Takes a while because the endometrium is quite thick during the proliferative phase. And here we go. So the epithelium is on top and it folds inward to form the endometrial glands. So you can see this infolding here has been a little bit cut off, but you can see that it continues down here. So as we go deeper, you can see all of these endometrial glands are just infoldings of the mucosa, such that we've got these very obvious characteristic endometrial glands. They tend to be sort of bunched up. So you see this one is straight and then it kind of gets all bunchy towards the bottom. And this is because during the proliferative phase, the growth of the endometrium is occurring so quickly that things get sort of scrunched, and this includes the endometrial glands and also the arteries. So I'm going to navigate back to that spiral artery so you can see an example of that. I believe it was over here and down. Where were you? There it is. So spiral arteries of the endometrium are another important feature because, of course, if there is an embryo burrowing into this layer, that embryo is going to need nourishment, and nourishment comes from maternal blood. So blood's got to be there. So here we've got a clump of arteries. Why am I calling them a spiral artery? That probably doesn't look especially spirally to you. Well, imagine a spiral. A cylindrical spiral, like a spring. Now imagine that you cut it along its length, such that the only representation you have of the spiral is looking at its cut length. It doesn't look especially spirally now, does it? And yet it used to be because you sliced it, right? So that's what these arteries would look like if you could see them in 3 dimensions. They would look like a messy spiral, where they would be kind of doing this. But because we're slicing this tissue very thin, you just see the cut edge. So that's why it doesn't look as spirally as you might expect. And so let's zoom in a little bit before I move down to the myometrium. And if you look side by side, although both the vessels of the spiral artery and the endometrial glands have a lumen, you can see that as far as their histology, they're very different. So endometrial glands are going to have a pseudostratified epithelium, whereas arteries are going to have a squamous epithelium and a much smaller lumen. So they are different. Okay, zooming out. Now we are down to the myometrium. And the myometrium is primarily smooth muscle. So I'm going to go to the center of it. And let's zoom in right about here. So the myometrium is smooth muscle, but the uterus is a hollow, sort of pear-shaped organ. And it has to rhythmically contract in multiple different dimensions. So not straight down, not side to side, but kind of squeeze spherically to expel either endometrial lining that is no longer needed or, of course, a baby, right? So for this reason, the smooth muscle of the endometrium, or excuse me, myometrium, my bad, myometrium, runs in multiple directions. So here we have some longitudinal smooth muscle. Here we have some cross-sectional. Here we have more longitudinal. Here's more cross-sectional. So with regard to the fiber direction of the smooth muscle of the myometrium, sort of mentally imagine a ball of yarn where you have this ball of yarn, but within the ball, there are many different fibers running in many different directions. Same idea. Over here, we've got a bunch of blood vessels. Here we have a vein, I know because it's got a collapsed lumen, and here are a bunch of little arteries. Let's move this. So the cells and tissues of the myometrium are mostly smooth muscle and a little bit of connective tissue, but they need blood and oxygen too. So there's lots and lots of vascular tissue, which is to say arteries and veins, in this layer as well. Also, relating this to the hormone stuff that you guys are learning, you may know that oxytocin is a powerful smooth muscle stimulant. It causes smooth muscle contraction. And oxytocin is therefore pivotal during labor and delivery of a child. The oxytocin in question gets to the uterus via these blood vessels. That's the pathway for it. So these are very important. If they were not there, uterine contractions would not work. Alrighty. And so our myometrium is quite thick. As we approach the edge, you can see some even larger blood vessels. And the smooth muscle becomes interspersed with loose connective tissue, and you can even see some fat cells. So dense irregular connective tissue and fat on the very edge. And then if we continue scrolling down, we get to this layer, which I'll zoom in on. This is the perimetrium. So this right here is the outermost layer of smooth muscle. So this is the end of the myometrium. And then here we have some dense regular connective tissue, and that is the perimetrium. So the perimetrium is made out of dense regular connective tissue. So it is a protective layer on the outside of the uterus. I'm telling you the tissue name so you know how to recognize the perimetrium when you say it. But if I ask you a practical question, which has an arrow pointing to this layer or maybe a bracket, I like to bracket layers, you can tell I'm talking about a whole layer. And I say something like, identify the bracketed layer. You need to give me the layer name that's specific to the organ, in this case, the uterus. Now, I would probably not have it this far zoomed in for that particular question, but regardless, if you give me a layer name, it needs to be specific to the organ. So in this case, dense irregular connective tissue would not be an acceptable answer because although you're not wrong about the tissue type, your answer does not tell me whether you know you're looking at the uterus or not, which is kind of the crux of the content of the first practical. All right, so that is the layers of the uterus. And that will conclude our video on this topic.